Okay, so quickly I'm going to go through Chapter 6, Code of the Street. All right, so last time for Chapter 5 we talked about the role of the decent daddy, right? So this is kind of transitioning to what is the decent role model for women within these communities. So there's a very strong importance within a lot of families, but especially within the Black community, of the mother, the role of the mother, right? This very important role within the family. And of course, by extension, the grandmother, who often is the person that organizes the larger family, right? There's a special place in folklore for mothers and grandmothers when it comes to the kind of stories and narratives that have captured the understandings of the community over time. They're a traditional pillar of strength in the community. We'll get to the kind of specifics of why that is and how that works in a minute. But basically, because of their specific social location, right? Because of their difference in gender, they weren't viewed in the same way as Black men in society. So they were able to kind of exhibit a different kind of role of strength that was different from that of white women and different from that of Black men. And so these women are more strained to provide help, right? They don't have the same kind of financial resources. They do have networks, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but not often for the financial rewards. Um, and as less women are aging into the role, this makes the problems of the inner city far greater because these women are a check, just like the decent father, on the kind of value system and problems that come from the code of the street. So, first, to understand the role of the grandmother then and now, there's a little terminology, right? Hegemony, right? The kind of dominant view of society. So, it's important to understand how women are viewed in the kind of cultural hegemony to really understanding how the role of these specific Black women differs because of the specific nature of what's needed for these women, right? So I'm going to show you this quick clip just to kind of explain what hegemony is. That's one of those $10 words you hear a lot, especially within sociology, but this should hopefully clarify that a bit.
Hey, welcome to another episode of 10 Minute Philosophy, the show that's bringing the tools of critical thought into the 21st century, 10 minutes at a time. According to my to-do list today, we're focusing on philosophical terms, and the term of the day is hegemony, or more precisely, cultural hegemony. Now, this is an important concept that in many ways is the backbone of a lot of contemporary cultural theory and behavioral science. The word has been around for a long time. It derives from the Greek verb meaning to lead, but it's usually associated with ideas about domination and control, as in the means by which one group dominates and controls another. So let's start by thinking of it as a special type of agreement. It's an agreement in which the person agreeing doesn't necessarily understand what it is that they've agreed to. The author most commonly associated with the contemporary use of the term is a Marxist thinker named Antonio Gramsci, although he was building on the work of a lot of people who came before him, like Nietzsche, Machiavelli, and of course Marx. Gramsci's developed his theories of cultural hegemony in what are now called the Prison Notebooks, a long series of essays he wrote while imprisoned by the Italian fascist regime from 1926 to 1935. Now, I don't want to put words in Gramsci's mouth, but I like to think that these notebooks started with him looking out the window of his prison cell and being like, "What? Seriously? Fascism? What the hell's going on here? Why would anybody in like a zillion years ever be like, oh yeah, fascism, let's do this. What could possibly go wrong?" Anyways, Gramsci died shortly after his release due to his deteriorating health from his living conditions while in prison. But the theories that he developed while in prison lived on. Now, like the Shawshank Redemption of intellectual theory, his ideas slowly drilled their way into the consciousness of cultural theory. His notebooks were smuggled out of prison and were eventually published in the 1950s and then translated into English in the 1970s and have since taken behavioral science by storm. Now, his theories are dense and complex, and it's obvious that he was in stressful conditions while he was writing them, but once you get a rough idea of what he was mapping out, it's not too hard to see what he was trying to say. Let's start by looking at some easy examples of how power and cultural work was something that you may have already heard before. It's called The Riddle of Steel, and it's from the 1982 movie Conan the Barbarian.
The riddle of steel.
Yes. You know what it is, don't you, boy? Shall I tell you? It's the least I can do. Steel isn't strong, boy. Flesh is stronger. Look around you. There, on the rocks. That beautiful girl. Come to me, my child. That is strength, boy. That is power.
So, putting it in terms that Gramsci would agree with, the riddle of steel is the recognition that weapons are nothing compared to the belief of the people that are wielding the weapons. Or, to put it differently, controlling a person's loyalty is the key to power. For Gramsci, power comes from consent, and according to him, it originates in subtle, otherwise innocuous types of agreement. Gramsci further challenges us by suggesting this process is even more complicated than it may first seem, by suggesting that people don't control ideas, but rather ideas control people. Or, to put it differently, people don't wield power. Power wields people. Here's an example of this in action. Over in the US, we're edging up on the 2016 elections. Elections are a great time to watch hegemony in action. So, take a typical Joe. At some point, Joe will be presented with a political ideology. This ideology will include pleasant-sounding ideas and beliefs, often very vaguely defined, that Joe may agree with. Once Joe decides that he agrees with that ideology or political party, then he'll make all of his political decisions from that point on, not from his own judgment, but from the answers that his political ideology has decided for him. That, my friends, is hegemony. But don't judge Joe too harshly. We do this sort of thing all the time. For example, I'm going to bet that a lot of you put a pine tree, or maybe even a plastic pine tree, in your house this Christmas and decorated it with plastic ornaments. Why? Why a pine tree? Why not some other type of tree? Or, another example, men often give women a diamond ring when they propose to them. Why? Why not some other type of pretty rock? Or why do we grow grass in our front yards instead of, I don't know, food? Now, the point Gramsci wants to make isn't that we should weigh the merit of these particular traditions in and of themselves necessarily, but rather that we need to pay attention to how these ideas got put in our head in the first place. You didn't think up the idea of putting trees indoors, or rocks on rings, or growing inedible crops. These ideas were given to you, and they are the ideas that literally control your actions, at least in the sense that you exhibit specific behaviors and actions simply because these ideas are in your head. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are political, economic, religious, and ethnic ideas, all of which you accept passively, that govern your actions and behaviors every day. It's actually kind of frightening when you realize how many things you do every day without having any idea why you're doing them. And this collective influence of all these different ideas on your actions is what Gramsci meant by cultural hegemony. So, let's try to tease out some helpful metaphors that can give us some insight into hegemony by taking a quick jump into the plot of some classic movies. Let's start with Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter. Remember how for the first half of the story, people wouldn't even say his name out loud? Looking at that behavior from a hegemonic point of view, we can see that the behavior wasn't just an expression of Voldemort's power, it actually was his power. If you wouldn't say his name, you were indirectly consenting to the belief in his authority and expressing that belief in your actions. The only exception, of course, being our hero, Harry Potter, who wouldn't concede to Voldemort's power even in a social convention. That's standing up to cultural hegemony. Another helpful example is J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Tolkien did a brilliant job of never really going into much detail about what the ring's magical powers actually were. That's because, like the plastic pine tree in your house on Christmas, the thing in and of itself is, as a point of fact, rather uninteresting. It's the idea of the thing, the concept of the thing, and the ways in which that idea affect people's behavior that demonstrates real power. Here's another, simpler example. Disney's Aladdin. The metaphor for power here is quite obviously the magical genie. But notice how the power of the genie drags Aladdin into a behavior that goes against his nature. When Aladdin gets the princess, he does so through a web of lies that were given credit to by his acceptance of the genie's power. And this is the point where power starts to wield people. In order to keep the magic alive, Aladdin has to act in a way that he doesn't actually want to participate in, but he must to preserve the web of dishonesty that got him there in the first place. And he isn't genuinely free until he lets the genie go. Likewise, Frodo isn't free until he lets go of his burden. Or Harry Potter, who eventually wins by literally getting Voldemort out of his head, like physically. I mean, they were a little on the nose with that one. Voldemort was something that was put into Harry's mind when he couldn't think for himself as a child. Well played, Rowling. Well played. So, our next question is, how do we put these ideas into practical use? Well, enter Pierre Bourdieu and his work on what he calls field theory. Now, bear in mind this is just one of many approaches to hegemony, but for a video of this size, Bourdieu seems like the sensible choice. So, Bourdieu complicates Gramsci's ideas by trying to situate them in the real day-to-day world of social life. Bourdieu argues that each of us are constantly navigating our way through various fields. These fields consist of any number of social networks like where you work, where you hang out, where you go to school, etc. And when you enter into one or more of these fields, you adopt various identities, and these identities offer various advantages or disadvantages depending on the situation. So looking at just one person, we can see that the individual is a focal point upon which a huge amount of symbols and ideas and beliefs are anchored. This individual, in turn, makes their way through this web of symbols by adopting various identities in different situations. These identities are coded, and the individual expresses these identities depending on their circumstances at any given moment. If we couple Bourdieu with Gramsci, we'll notice an interesting parallel, namely that the identities that the individual adopts are constructed out of symbols that the individual themselves didn't create. That is to say, according to Bourdieu, your identity is given to you by society rather than created by you. This begs a further question. Given the situation, who is the authentic you? And can that individual ever actually be expressed in a way that isn't embedded in a web of symbols that are themselves all networked in structures of power? Well, that's a question we can ask a little further down the road, perhaps. But for now, let's assume that there actually is a distinct you in the middle of that bubble of symbols. And that you, and the bubble around you, are what Bourdieu calls the habitus. And the habitus provides us with a way to measure and gauge where you are in the network of culture. This network, in turn, which is made up of millions of little habitus bubbles, is the overall mechanism which decides the course of political, economic, and cultural action. For example, if the collective habitus of a particular group is fashioned appropriately, then you can predict how that group will act towards another group, say by teaching one group to hate the word terrorist and then labeling another group terrorist. You can now control how both groups will act. This is hegemony. This is also, quite often, very overwhelming to deal with, especially seeing as any scholar trying to work on this type of thing is quick to notice that they themselves will inevitably be caught in a web of hegemony of some sort, and thus have their own behavior measured and controlled by whatever narrative it is that they have identified with. This being the case, most behavioral scientists break this approach into smaller subsets like political, economic, religious, or cultural hegemony. But while it is a challenging theory, it can still be useful. Here's a way you can try it yourself by keeping an eye out for a phenomenon called code switching. Say you and your friends are playing video games. While you're in this field, you're probably going to adopt a very particular identity, one that includes a relaxed and playful way of speaking. Then, let's say, work calls. As soon as you answer the phone, your way of speaking and acting will change. You'll tend to be more formal and structured in the way that you address the person on the phone. If your friends are paying attention, they'll know that you're talking to your boss based simply off the change in your behavior. And this is what we mean when we say code switching. It's an indicator that lets you know that hegemony is at play. Learning to see this kind of thing will allow you to get a better idea of where you are in the complex matrix of cultural power and hopefully will allow you to start choosing your beliefs and actions more deliberately, so that eventually, like Aladdin, someday you too will be able to free yourself from the prison of cultural hegemony and truly think for yourself. Well, we're running out of time for this episode. Feel free to leave examples of what you see as cultural hegemony in the comments. As always, thanks for watching. Do a man a favor, hit that good old subscribe.
Okay, so like we discussed before, with the advent of the industrial economy, this role changed, right? So before the industrial economy, most people produced food or goods or whatever it was within the home or within the homestead, right? A lot of people of color that had, post or like Reconstruction era post-slavery were doing a lot of the same kind of things they were doing before, which was sharecropping, right? Where basically you got a piece of land, but someone else owns that land. And now you're working off of that land and you have to pay to be able to use that specific plot of land so that you can make any money and eke out a living, right? So it wasn't really that better of a standing and situation for a lot of people Reconstruction era and afterwards. So during that time period, though, the roles of men and women were very similar because there's not a lot of gender division of labor when it comes to the farm, right? There's this idea that you all wake up at the early ass crack of dawn and get up, you, your wife, your husband, your kids, whoever, everyone gets up, everyone works. And so it wasn't until the advent of the industrial economy that the value system of the larger economy, that men are more valued than women, was reflected in the industrial wages that were given, right? So it's not as if women didn't work in the industrial economy. It's not as if kids didn't work in the industrial economy, right? They did. But their money was not their own, right? Women couldn't control their own money. So as they could work for wages, their husband got their wages, right? Or their father, or whoever it was that, was able to control those, because God forbid women control their own wages, right? Or children, mind you. So, with the advent of the industrial economy, it was solidified this expectation that men are the breadwinner. Men were paid more because the expectation is they're taking care of their family. If a wife is earning money, that's just supplemental, right? And this is kind of why we still have a huge inequality problem when it comes to financial things between men and women, right? But this advent of the industrial economy really changed the nature of the situation where basically men were now able to provide some things that they had been denied through racial discrimination, bias, etc., the generation before the industrial economy. So in a lot of ways, this meant that the role of the grandmother kind of diminished, right? But as there was a loss of jobs, the deindustrialization, so basically we had an industrial economy where we had a bunch of factories, and now we got rid of all those factories, put them somewhere else. That caused a loss of jobs, right? And a huge rise in the drug economy. And so these grandmothers were kind of asked to, hey, come out of retirement, come back and fulfill this traditional role that was going on within communities prior to the industrial economy happening. So this role of the grandmother is something that is a central role that's institutionalized in the Black community. Well, also in a lot of communities, right? This role of the grandmother is often the person that is what they call kin keepers, right? So, for myself personally, before my grandmother on my mother's side passed away, that was the person who had every family function, right? Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, everything. She was the person that kept everyone together, right? So she was the person that kind of like not only talked to her kids and her grandkids and her whatever, but she organized the family and kind of kept those connections real, right? My grandmother on the other side right now is 94 years old, which is crazy, and she's like smart as hell, and I'm like, please let me get your genes. But basically, she she came from Canada when my dad was young, and so as a result, she is the kin keeper to hundreds of people that I don't know who they are. I've been there a couple times and I've met some of these people, but there's just like a whole bunch of these relatives and these people, that connections, and this person had a kid, and all of those connections that the person that writes all those crazy Christmas cards and all of those kind of things. That's an important role within any family or community, right? Is someone that keeps everyone together, keeps everyone communicating, right? Like oftentimes those extended family members don't talk to each other, but they do talk to this person that's the kin keeper, right? And in a lot of ways, women had to really fight against these black women had to fight against these racialized stereotypes of black women, right? There's the Jezebel, the Sapphire, right? And he talks about it a little bit in the chapter, but these persistent myths and perceptions of black women as overbearing or controlling or manipulative, or like the Jezebel, like sexually alluring, or these kind of things were really difficult stereotypes to counter, right, for a lot of women, as they were an easy way to marginalize these women. So when it comes to teen pregnancy, it's really interesting. There's a community distinction between the biological mother and the real mother. So the real mother is the one who actually takes care of the kid, right? So, from a personal example, from my own family, I have like a cousin that's just a piece of crap. She's awful. And she is in her kid's life, isn't in her kid's life, kind of drops in and out. She's on drugs. I mean, she quit doing drugs. Now she's just an awful person in other ways. But anyway, she's awful. But no, trust me, if you met her, you'd be like, oh, terrible. But anyway, she just kind of dropped off her kid on my aunt and uncle. And of course, no one really wants to enable their child to be a terrible parent, right? But at the same time, you worry about the welfare of that child, right? So in a lot of ways, my aunt and uncle have become the parents of this kid. So even though he knows his biological mother is my awful cousin Leah, he calls my aunt mom. He calls my uncle dad. He calls her Leah, right? He understands. And so it's that same kind of thing. There is a big difference, right, between having the biological materials to make someone and actually being the person that makes sure that they're financially provided for, makes sure they're safe, tucks them in at night, takes them to school every day, those kind of real responsibilities. So in these communities where teens are often pregnant, it's acknowledged that oftentimes, yes, maybe that young girl is the mother, but she's not actually fulfilling that role. That's oftentimes her mother fulfilling that role. Also, young men's expectations are really kind of pulled into this as well. So just like we talked about before, how a lot of young girls' expectations is to kind of get back in the game, right? And go back and start dating and these kind of things. A lot of those expectations also fall within young men, right? They also have these expectations of kind of being free, I guess, not attached. So even if they do end up impregnating somebody, oftentimes it's like they're going to deny that they're the father, or those kind of things within this specific neighborhood he's looking at for his research, because no one has the economic viability in order to actually stand up and meet those expectations, right? So the shifting expectations of younger men is to just not really get involved in that role, right? That they don't have to parent as much, right? That a mom parents, that because a human, or a human the size of a bowling ball comes out of your body, that you are more naturally suited to take care of it. When you're like, well, to make it takes two, so to parent it also takes two, right? So in a way, the grandmother in these communities is seen as a hero because she's holding things together and she's making it so that those kids are not suffering and facing a lot of consequences because of it, right? And in a lot of ways, she has this role of an activator, which means that she often is the person who can mobilize other people to step in and help, right? So oh, this teen's pregnant, there's not anyone to take care of the kid. Oftentimes they're able to get aunts and uncles or other people in the family to step up and help, who wouldn't have done it necessarily otherwise. So then when crack hits the street, it's kind of considered the fall, right? It's really sad. And he kind of gets into this whole thing of how, this affects relationships between biological mothers and grandmothers, and how, grandmothers tried to understand the role of crack cocaine within the lives of people within the neighborhood. Part of it really comes down to that strong religious component again, having faith. So a lot of people feel that, in the community, feel that, it's God testing me, right? And so, an example of that is Betty's story that he goes into quite a bit in the chapter. So he talks about, Angela's drug problems, how, Angela's running around and, having sex without protection leads Betty to become a grandmother. And of course, a lot of the reason he uses these stories as examples is because they might be someone's specific atypical story, but oftentimes they're not atypical. They're often a reflection of what a lot of people experience in these issues, right? So court drama is not independent of just Betty and Angela. I know when we were talking about it in class, I was giving examples from like Teen Mom or 16 and pregnant and those kind of things. It's also an issue of that as well. So right, like even if you look at the issues of that TV show, you see a lot of the court drama, right? The kind of, who is taking legal custody for these children. And that's an important thing, right? Because if this grandmother is stepping in and she needs to be there for this baby that has a lot of health issues as a result of being born addicted to crack cocaine, she needs to have the legal guardianship so that she can make those medical decisions, right? Because if she's the one who's actually taking the kid to the doctor, she's the one who's actually taking them to their medical appointments, and the only person that can sign off is the legal guardian, who is the biological mother, that's a problem, right? Because she's not involved. Angela isn't going to those things. She's not there for her child. So it's important, these little stories or vignettes that he gives of the specific people he talks to within the neighborhood are typically, kind of a example of how that works for a lot of people within the neighborhood. So, within Betty's experience, she has, she is on, she basically is forced to quit her job as a nursing assistant because of the high cost of daycare, right? And the limitations of welfare. So she's not really able to kind of get the support that she needs to take care of this kid. And of course, she is financially strained to take care of it because of a lot of the medical issues as well. So, she has to have this kind of horrible decision to quit her job and live on a very specifically fixed welfare income that doesn't support her or, what she actually needs because of this, the need for the flexibility to be there for this baby that is not her biological kid, but has become her responsibility. So some of the implications for this, right? Again, those economic and social changes. This is really just looking at what are the larger structural issues that affect how people are able to operate within these neighborhoods, right? The fact that the economy has changed dramatically, that, doesn't give people the opportunities that they need. Part of this is really neoliberalism, right? The kind of 40-year march towards extreme rationalization that resulted in deindustrialization in the first place, right? Neoliberalism, don't think of it as liberal necessarily. It's kind of the opposite. It's this idea of turning everything into a monetary conceptive thing. Like actually right now, a good example of neoliberalism would be Betsy DeVos, right? The new Secretary of Education that wants to have public funds go towards private schools or towards charter schools and those kind of things that are privately run, so they don't have the same kind of oversight as other things. So neoliberalism is kind of basically famous for trying to privatize everything, turn everything into an economic unit. And so the fact that that's been going on for 40 years within the culture has a huge impact. And again, not something that necessarily people within these poor communities can just like, oh, let me just change the larger social structure of neoliberalism that's been going on for 45 years. It's like, no, that's not something you can necessarily affect as an individual, right? Another big issue is residential segregation, right? This is, again, the history of redlining, the history of the racial segregation of neighborhoods. It has a large impact on today, right? People like to be like, oh, that was the past. These are different now, blah. And it's like, they're not. And the reason they're not is because there's an actual legacy of these things, right? You deny someone opportunities 50 years ago, that means their families are going to be in a different situation than other people's that were given opportunities 50 years ago. I mean, it seems obvious, but people like to say it's playing the race card or it's this or that. But really, it's just an actual awareness of the reality of inequality and segregation that's happened as a result. And, he talks about how there's a lot more inclusion that happened into American culture, but a lot of this benefited the middle class and educated, right? So the kind of jobs that are available that have gotten a lot of people in the Black community out of poverty were not necessarily swooped up by people that were in the most endemic or marginalized poverty, right? These are people that were already pretty much going to mainstream schools, going to middle class valued schools. Typically, those who already have better financial opportunities, so that means they have better educational opportunities, right? So you're not going to be able to get that great job if you don't have that degree, right? That's why all you guys are coming to class. So, it's sad because when those opportunities did actually open up, it really only benefited those that were already at the top. And so this has strong implications for the way that poor Black families operate because basically you're coming up in a situation where, again, I mean, we talked about this before, where you probably aren't being exposed to people that have college degrees and have success because of it, right? The majority of the people you're coming in contact with, it's again affected by this rise in the underground economy, right? The majority of people you're coming in contact with that have financial stability, that have a lot of money, are those that are doing something illegal. So when you take away legal opportunities and all that replaces it is an illegal system of an underground economy, that's obviously going to affect what opportunities people have and what they end up doing with their lives. So it's not as if the people within the code of the street don't see the value systems of larger society. And I'm pretty sure you've noticed, if you've ever had television, that we are super commercial in this culture, right? We are like capitalism to the extreme. So everyone wants money, wealth, prestige, right? All the kind of crap that comes with money. So these young Black men, they want what the white people have, right? But in a lot of ways, because part of the code of the street is just acknowledging, the differences, the racial segregation, the discrimination, the different treatment of police, etc., means that people feel alienated, so they dress unconventionally, right? And this counterculture emerges with a strong statement against dominant society, meaning if you wear a certain look, then you're basically wearing a look that says screw society. That's something I can totally personally relate to because I was super into punk rock when I was younger. Not that I'm not into it now, but I don't dress like that necessarily now. Like not like sporting a tri-hawk or anything like that. But basically when you see someone with their like leather vest and all their studs and patches and their, mohawk, basically, just seeing that person, their physical resemblance is a rejection of mainstream society, right? So in the same way, the code kind of produced its own counterculture. So the decent and the street end up representing these polarities around which social identity is worked out and formed, meaning that, how you look, how you dress, how you stand, how you talk, how you walk, everything is going to be kind of understood within the community as decent or street. And so how much, basically clout you have, how much respect you have, is going to be affected by if people perceive you to be decent or straight, right? So I remember in previous chapters they were talking about how some of the decent kids would like go to school, but they would bring clothes and like change into other clothes on the way to school because their parents wouldn't let them wear that stuff. But because their parents knew that their kids are dressing like these gang-affiliated kids or these street-oriented kids, and they didn't want their kids getting caught up in that, right? So they would obviously tell their kids not to do that. But then their kids want respect. They want power. They want girlfriends, right? And since the street-oriented are the ones that are getting the respect, the power, the prestige, and the girlfriends, they would often kind of mimic that. And oftentimes it's a slippery slope into the culture. So because the decent are losing clout and energy, very few are being replaced. So the street element is free to kind of take over and force its own narrative and cultural expectations on the entire community.